All right. Well, hey, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Heromakers podcast. If you guys are going to watch this on YouTube, you'll see that Ann is waving. I'm thinking they need to develop some kind of technology where even through podcasts, you could kind of see. Or I was thinking, Ann, I was thinking about the other day about when they're going to develop like a smell, like an app that you can smell through your phone. So you can have like nice smells of teas or
That'd be nice.
something like that.
Like aromatherapy.
Aromatherapy. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sure someday it'll come, but not yet. So you guys, we're having a great season 3 here, and I'm very, very, very excited about our guest today because we're going to talk about like some good, deep, important issues that I think all of us need to hear as we head into this new year. And so let me just hop in here and welcome Cole Arthur Riley to the podcast. Cole, how are you?
I'm okay. How are you?
Okay, I'm okay. And Cole is founder of this great project called Black Liturgies. And I was, Cole, I was scrolling through like a lot of stuff on your Instagram feed, and you guys can find a lot of really great stuff over there. But it's kind of like formatted around like an idea and then some kind of quick prayers. And it's so good. So we're going to talk about your work with the Black Liturgies, where you address issues like lament and rage and some of the topics that some of us maybe feel, but we find it hard to press into some of those. But I think it's also really, really important here. So, and you're also telling us that you serve as spiritual teacher in residence at Cornell University, which is really interesting. So hopefully we'll talk about that as well. But Cole, let's start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and your upbringing and just kind of get us up to speed about, who are you and yeah, what about that?
Sure. I was born and for the most part raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grew up in the city and was raised by my father, and eventually a very lovely stepmother. And in my family, it's really kind of all hands on deck. And so I would say I was also raised by my grandma and my Aunt Jenny and my Uncle Dave and all of these people in my life who, I've lived with at different points and who have lived with us at different points. So it's a very fluid caregiving pattern in my family, which I love. And I didn't grow up in a overtly religious home. I think that my family definitely had a kind of spirituality in it, but it was less about kind of like going to church and more about things like storytelling and myth and yeah, and writing even, I would say, and humor. Humor was really big in my family. So we definitely had a spirituality, but it wasn't certainly wasn't a Christian, a traditional Christian spirituality, but later on in life became curious about God, about what I believe about things, and ended up on this path toward prayer and contemplative spirituality that I'm on now.
So Cole, I am very interested in people who grow up in kind of more of an extended family setting where they have different generations impacting them in different ways. I never
Mhm.
had that. And so I think there's a part of me that's always like, oh, I wish I would have had my grandparents around or my great grandparents. Um, what what were maybe one or two of the lessons that you learned from maybe your grandparents or extended family that have stayed with you in your journey?
Mhm. Yeah, I would say um, my grandma in particular had a very strong sense of self, which I think I have definitely found. And now that I'm entering my 30s, I can say I feel very kind of grounded in who I am and even a kind of peace about who I am. And so the word kind of stern comes to mind, but what I mean is that my grandma was someone who would not bend who she was to acquiesce to a particular situation or a particular person and what they wanted. And I think that's very rare. I think that takes a lot of courage, especially for a Black woman living in the times that she's lived through. But she always had just this kind of fidelity to self that I admired. And I think I'm starting to glimpse pieces of that in me.
Hmm. That's so great. Yeah, this kind of one, it takes a commitment to like to know who you are, right? It takes maybe this intentionality of like going deep enough where you're like, this is what I'm about, this is what I stand for, and then courage to be that person, even when those around you maybe aren't, right? And you're right. Like I think that is hopefully we'll see that more and more. And I think we're seeing that a little bit. Cole, I don't know how you feel about that, but I feel like signs of hope in that area, that I feel like we're seeing people who feel a little bit more empowered to be who they are and who they were made to be. Do you sense that?
I do. And I have a lot of criticisms of social media, probably more than we have time to talk about. But I think one kind of silver lining in it is that young people more and more have access to different kinds of people, different voices who might not be in physical proximity to them, but who they now have access to, so they can have an imagination for a different way of being, or for honoring a way that they are um, that might not feel like it fits with the people that they're, in proximity to physically. And I didn't have that. And we didn't have that when we were younger. We didn't, it was like you had the people that were around you, and that's who you looked to in terms of figuring out who you wanted to be. And now I think that's opened up a lot. Of course, that comes with a lot of damaging things as well, like comparison and, flattery and wanting to be someone you're not as well. But I think in terms of having an imagination for different ways of being and different identities, we have more access to that now.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting comment. I think that in that way, we can also just find our tribe, you know what I mean? Like find people who are like-minded, whereas we wouldn't have had access to those people beforehand.
And so all of those little doubts or like, distinctions, you just try to kind of suppress because belonging is so important. And so I don't blame anyone for doing that, but it becomes a little bit easier when you start to see those things in you mirrored in someone else. And you're like, okay, maybe I'll let this breathe in me a little bit more than I ordinarily would.
So I have a question for you. When you're talking about your grandma and just how she was loyal to herself, like I was actually teaching a leadership course to university students this past semester, and we talked a little about, or tried to really communicate to them to pay attention to their bodies and to pay attention to even their gut, because I think that we're taught, to ignore our gut and like, or you know what I mean. And I think that maybe our instincts as well, or it's just like, so what would your advice be to my students?
My husband and my brother-in-law, we were just talking about this over dinner last night, that we more and more believe that everyone has this kind of sacred intuition, and maybe it exists on a spectrum, but I think everyone certainly has it, like a kind of inner voice and inner wisdom in their bodies, an embodied intuition and it's complicated because I talk about fear some in my book, and I think fear can get such a bad rap, but I think it's one of those examples of embodied wisdom and like an embodied intuition that sometimes we have that we don't immediately apprehend. And it's like, something is happening to my body, I don't feel safe, I can't articulate exactly what it is, but my body knows before I do. And I think that's just one example of how being attuned to your body, listening to your body can really be a force of protection, a protective force in someone's life.
That's fascinating. That's so interesting, Cole. I'm a 7 on the Enneagram, and sevens like don't like their bodies. They run away from anything that's like the physical, tangible. And so, and I'm trying to learn, Cole, to like be more present in my body, because I think it does. It kind of speaks to us in different ways and has a lot to teach us. So, okay, so, and I want to talk about fear later, because I read part of that chapter in your book and I loved it. And there was a quote I want to talk about later. But Cole, we have, so our listeners are a little bit diverse, and we don't actually usually talk about issues of spirituality on this podcast. So I'm very excited to jump into this space. Some of them are Christians, some are other faiths, probably, some are no faith at all. But talk to us about, like, you mentioned that you kind of came to faith, right? Like, it wasn't, when you were growing up, it wasn't like this big bedrock or anything. So talk to us about kind of your own journey with your faith, and then how that led to Black Liturgies and what you're doing now.
Sure. My first encounters with like I hate this word, but like Orthodox Christian church setting was after my uncle Jack passed away, and my aunt needed someone to go to church with. And so my family started going to church with her for like a year. And it was this all white Baptist, quite conservative church. And frankly terrified me. It had a lot of Christianese, a lot of assimilation that, and I was a shy child anyways, that I never really felt like I belonged to. And so, after that experience, I was just kind of like, it's a no for me. I'm not interested in kind of organized religion. But slowly, I mean, especially later on in high school and in college, couldn't deny that I was curious about these kind of big questions, these big meaning of life questions, questions of creation and maybe something divine and cosmic. And so I found myself in a number of white dominated spaces that didn't really honor my personhood enough for me to feel safe to explore as much as I wanted to. And so I would say it was after college that I really began to make sense of who I wanted to be spiritually outside of what I think churches sometimes can demand of you. And I'm even if you're not religious, I'm sure many people who are listening will resonate with this. That so often religious spaces demand you believe a certain 1, 2, 3 things in order to belong to their space. And I think it really makes for a laziness, I think, in humans, a laziness. You become kind of prone to saying you think things that you don't think, believe things that you don't believe. And so, finding spaces that weren't threatened by a diversity of viewpoints, weren't threatened by other religions, other experiences, weren't threatened by atheism, like gave me room to explore and understand who I am. Now, as far as Black liturgies, I've always been a writer. I was, again, a very shy child, and my dad would always have us write, poems and stories. Like, we would have contests with each other in the car, and, he would judge us, or to get out of chores, he'd be like, well, you can mop the kitchen, or you could give me a poem, and so I think he knew I needed a tool for expression apart from verbal expression very early on. And I found that in writing. And so when I started to become honest about who I am, more grounded in my selfhood, I realized, like, I can't be a spiritual person outside of that kind of natural form of expression for me, outside of writing. And so even before Black liturgies, I would write prayers, and in my work with college students would kind of guide them to write down spiritual thoughts and reflections and questions and whatnot. I started Black liturgies in July of 2020. And, as most of us will remember, that was a tense time for the world. It was in the wake of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd, and the resurfacing of the murders of Breonna Taylor and Elijah McClain. And I really needed a space to be able to articulate, things like lament and grief and anger without having it being kind of like dismissed quickly. And I think that's a tendency, especially in Western spirituality, to to brush over pain, and to kind of adopt this toxic positivity under the guise of hope, but it's not true hope, right? It's just kind of trying to suppress someone else's complicated emotion. And so I wanted Black Liturgies to be a space that allowed for that, that connected Black literature with spirituality, Black emotion with spirituality, the Black body with spirituality, and was just hoping people would join me on the journey.
So Cole, when you started this, was this kind of your own ideation, or were you hearing from other people a similar desire and need for this type of thing?
No, I mean, I don't doubt that there are people in my orbit who were feeling similarly, but it didn't come out of any conversations really. I was just in bed one night and I turned to my husband and I said, I think I'm gonna start this thing called Black Liturgies, and I'm gonna share, I'm gonna mix poems and literature and quotes from Black thinkers with Black spirituality. And, I had this I only had an imagination for like 12 of us. I was like, if it's just like 12 of us forming this little, micro community, and like, I mean, quickly found that it was going to be a lot more than that, which is great. But I really didn't have an imagination for what it is now.
Yeah. I feel like I'm going to go back to the idea that your dad said, well, you can either, clean and help to clean the house and mop, or you can, write poetry. And I hear in that your dad is what we would call here, he would be a hero maker, right? So he saw something in you, wanted to cultivate it, and, and got you kind of, he was your journey partner, right? So he helped you on your journey. And then, you got to this point where you knew what you wanted to do, right? You're laying in bed, you're like, hey, I think I need to do this. And then you did it. And so Cole, there's thousands of people who are so grateful that you did it, right? There's a lot of us who have ideas and then they never come to fruition, right? We're like, I should do this, I should do that. What was the thing that like pushed you to actually do this and actually say, I'm going to put this out there and just see if anybody responds to it? Like, was it just such a desire? Was it the cultural moment? What was it that made it so important?
Yeah, I think, it doesn't sound pretty, but when I'm most honest, I think it was born mostly out of anger. And I hope it was the good kind of anger. I hope it was the anger that's, about refusing to accept injustice. Like, I hope it was that kind of anger, at least on some level. But I was so angry at the Christian spaces specifically that I was encountering that weren't capable of rising to the moment to meet what Black people needed. In that moment, I was just, I was so, I was angry, and I didn't want to endure the violence of those spaces anymore. And so out of that, I was like, I'm just gonna make another space. I'm gonna create this, other option that allows for more of me.
Yeah.
I want to say thank you. I just followed you yesterday. I think that's the beauty of doing this podcast, is you're following all these like beautiful people. But as a woman of color, I've just said to people and my friends that we have to carve out spaces. Yes. We're not like given, but we have to carve it, which actually is hard work. So I just want to say thank you for doing that. I have a few questions. Like, can you explain to our listeners what liturgy is? Because I think we get Black maybe, but I don't think it's
Hopefully I get
liturgy
that
this
much.
easily. And then also you have like 137,000 followers. And like what have you heard back from people on Black liturgies and what you are saying and what you're carving, the space that you're carving?
Mhm. Um, Liturgy, when people are saying liturgy, usually they're talking about a form for a religious service or prayer. So it's usually not just prayer. It's, if you ever have attended a Catholic or an Anglican or Episcopalian service, there's kind of this format that remains. It's like this, it's a rhythm, and you know in general what the format is going to be. But I think the word rhythm in that sticks out to me. It's something that you would typically try to make a habit out of doing. But it's also curated in such a way that in my personal opinion, and I don't think everyone needs to love a liturgical spirituality, but in my personal opinion, I found it to be a real relief in spiritual spaces to not always have to have the words to say. I've had seasons in my life where, you know, whether it be depression or just the situations of the moment were so intense that I couldn't muster words to pray or say to engage with concepts of God. And so going to a space that kind of had that prepared, I experienced as a kind of relief, as well as a kind of belonging, because liturgy is typically communal. You do it, you recite it together. It's kind of, if you've never been, it can be kind of creepy at first. You're like, what's happening? Everyone's saying the same words at the same time. But in time, it's become more and more beautiful to me to have that kind of collective energy. Yeah. So that's liturgy. And then you asked how people have been responding to it. So, I mean, you want to talk about liturgy. It's it's so not for everyone, liturgical spirituality. Like I have friends and people I love very much who just are more, free spirited and would not thrive under that kind of spiritual environment. And so I was thinking like, it would be a hard sell. So I wasn't even imagining that many people would want to do it because I know so many people have this inner resistance to kind of collective words. And so I've been very surprised when it's actually a lot of non-Christians, a lot of people who don't attend church or wouldn't necessarily, I mean, wouldn't identify as Christian, but might say like, I'm vaguely spiritual. They'll message me and say, I'm not a Christian, but this really spoke to me, or I've been really thinking about this question. And I really love that because I've always been someone that's a lot more interested in like engaging questions and like then coming up with answers. And so yeah, I've found that to be really beautiful, surprising, but beautiful.
I think there's something too, Cole, about like what you said. You used the word rhythms. And I think that, after 2 years of being in this pandemic, it's been almost 2 years. And I think people are longing for that. I think they're longing for something that they know will be consistent. Some place that they could go where they can cry and weep and they don't always have to be happy. And maybe that's part of the reason that people are so drawn to what you do. I know when I was reading through like a number of your past posts that you had, like I would fall into that category of I don't love liturgy. But there is something about the way you do it in the fact that they're almost like they're breath prayers. They're simple, they're approachable, and they're honest. And that's what people are looking for right now. They're looking just for spaces where they can be honest and be real, right? Where we kind of drop the pretenses. What have you discovered anything about yourself, kind of over the past year of doing this that, I don't know, like just any new revelations about yourself or any areas of like growth or that you've had over the past year of doing this?
Yeah, absolutely. I Well, I'm not a people pleaser, and so I've always felt a bit immune to kind of the powers of social media and was like, you know, I want people to feel respected by me and I want people to feel understood by me, but I've never really felt like I need someone to like me, you know?
Mm.
And so starting this, I never really considered I'd, be one of those people who are worried about how other people are receiving the work that the writing that they're putting out. But, I'm here to say formally that I'm not immune. I,
Mm,
I have seen things in me, and I think, this is partially just the mechanism of social media and just the beast of it. I've seen things in myself that I've never seen in terms of wanting to be um noticed and wanting to be affirmed. And my friends, I've talked about this with some of my friends, and they're like, if you know the love languages, like affirmation is my lowest love
yeah,
language. Like
yeah.
I just don't receive love that way. I don't give love that way. And so it's been so strange for them to see it have any effect on me at all when,
Mm,
someone rejects my work or
mm.
a post doesn't seem to be resonating with people. And so I've had to really pay attention to the ways that these apps are forming me. I
Mm.
wasn't big on social media before. I still don't understand much of how it works. And I'm taking advice from other people about how to use all these tools and tricks. And so it's forming me, and it's forming me fast. And you know, when I'm honest, I'm not sure anyone was meant to have either the affirmation or the rejection of 137,000 people. Like, I just don't think humans were made for that.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so maybe some people have a greater threshold for it.
Mhm.
But I personally, I'm like, I don't know. I've had to pay attention to how this is forming me and what kind of things I'm going to put in place to protect myself and protect, that sense of self that we were talking about to begin with.
I have been so impressed, Cole, like with some of the people that we have, actually, most of the people that we've talked to on this podcast, that what strikes me as this desire of a hero maker is to buoy up other people, right? It's like we ourselves, we're not here to buoy ourselves up. And
Mhm.
it's like what you were saying, you launched this, you didn't necessarily want 100 and some thousand followers. You wanted 12, a tribe of 12 people, right? It's a little group. And then it grew. And then you had to kind of like check yourself and realize, like, okay, like, why am I doing this? And I think that that's really important for people to hear, in the sense that, what we're here for is not for accolades. It's not for numbers or metrics, and it's not for quantity, right? It's for quality, and it's for excellence, and it's for love, and it's for goodness, and these other things. And sometimes, like, the way that we measure things is not necessarily the way that, in like a God's economy, he measures things, right? um, and so I love that you're just laying that out there, because it gives people a little bit of a glimpse behind the curtain, and that numbers don't tell the whole story, right? There
Yeah.
is kind of this reckoning. We always have to kind of check within ourselves. Why are we doing what we're doing? Check the motivations, kind of keep doing that. But okay, Cole, I do want to jump to your book, though, because this is like, you have a book coming out in February, 2 to
Yes.
2 22 22.
22. Hmm.
Convergent Books. It's called This Here Flesh. So first, tell us about why that title, This Here Flesh.
Yes, thanks for asking. Not many people have so far. It comes from a scene in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, where one of the kind of matriarch characters um, gathers her people in the clearing and leads them in this kind of intergenerational practice with their bodies, their laugh. She tells them to laugh, she tells them to cry, She tells them to dance, and then they're lying in the grass after it, like everyone's collapsed in the grass together, and she gives this sermon, and she says, in this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass, love it. And she goes into this kind of monologue about the resistance in honoring these different parts of yourself. Your lips, she says, love your hands. They're not going to love your hands, over there. They're going to tie them. Like, love your neck. They don't love your neck unnoosed and straight. So and it's this kind of, resistance to that time, of slavery, of violence against Black bodies, and this beautiful proclamation of dignity, as well as this intergenerational embodied kind of spirituality, which is what I'm very interested in, and what the book is interested in. So I tell the stories of not only myself, but my father and my grandma, and kind of 3 generations of us making sense of what it means to be human in Black bodies.
I love that. And your book, I told you before the podcast that I got through 4 chapters. I picked it up too late, and I only got through 4 chapters, and I was just like so enthralled by your stories that you were sharing.
Mm-hmm.
And I love too how you lay out the book, Cole, which is around like specific topics: dignity, body, fear, lament, rage. Like these different things that we feel. I think that's it's really powerful. But I want to ask you about something.
Mm-hmm.
You have a quote in there that I loved, and I want you to explain it for us. And I want you to explain it for us in the context of like our stories and our identity, because I think all of us maybe have these stories that either from our family or from what we've experienced that they kind of make us who we are. And I want to kind of like just press into that for a little bit, and identity. So okay, so here's the quote. Here's the quote, Cole, which because you wrote it. When I think of my ancestors who lived in chains, I often wonder what sacred defiance lived in their minds while their bodies were being dominated by another. For the field and plow and whip can certainly affect the mind, but they cannot possess it. What hidden things of old crouched in the corners of my great grandmother's consciousness as she stood in the cotton fields? What stories, dreams, and beliefs about God hugged the crevices of her brain? The oppressor has no power in those deep and secret places. So how do the stories like we've experienced affect how we see things around us, like the beauty around us? And talk to us about that, and maybe embracing our stories, and how do we find beauty when we've been broken and we've been hurt, and finding victory in that somehow. That's a lot. I know I just asked you a lot of questions, so address any of those.
Thanks for reading that. First, it's very special to hear my words read back to me, and so thank you. I think, going back to that piece that I've written, I think so many times, when you hear kind of spiritual people talk about the interior life or contemplative life, like it can sound very, if I'm being most honest, it can sound very white, which isn't a problem, but certainly isn't me. It can sound hyper intellectualized, and I wanted people to understand that what I'm doing with this book isn't appealing to the white intellectuals that I spent the first half of my life appealing to. Like I'm actually appealing to something that's just completely true about the fact that my ancestors developed their sense of self and their sense of God and spirituality. They had to do it in private, and a lot of that had to be an interior journey. It had to live in their interior life. It had to be a contemplative spirituality, because it wasn't granted the liberty to be just expressed and named and articulated all of the time. And so part of that is tragic and part of it's beautiful, because I think we're meant to really hold close and protect and examine the stories that are forming us in our own time, and believe that it's not actually kind of doctrine or creed or these kind of top down demands that are forming you into what you think and believe. Our beliefs are formed by the stories that we've existed in, the stories that we've had to occupy or endure. And the more we practice habits of story exchange and remembrance, I think the more we understand who we are. um, Howard Thurman has this beautiful speech he gave to a group of Spelman college graduates, and people know it as this speech called The Sound of the Genuine. I'm not sure if either of you are familiar with it. Maybe you've just heard it, but not been able to read it. But in it, he says, there's something in you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in you. And there's so many sounds and noises going on, and so many impulses in you that are coming from outside of you, even, that are pulling you in these disparate directions. And in the midst of all of that, you have to find out what your name is. He says, who are you? What does the sound of the genuine say to you? And I think he's getting at this kind of practice of interior excavation. Who are you? What has made you? What has not just made you, but what made your grandma that could still be making you? If that makes sense.
Cole, this reminds me of this little book that Parker Palmer wrote, a white man, but it was a really good book.
Love Parker Palmer.
Yes. Okay. So it was his Let Your Life Speak, right? It was that little treasure.
Yes.
And if you remember, what he said is, he said, don't tell your life what you want it to be. Listen to what it's trying to say to you. And what you're saying is reminding me of that. But this is scary, Cole. Like it's scary for people to sit and just listen to what is going inside of us. And maybe you're a little bit more wired that way, and some people aren't. And so they just like what are we going to find when we stop and listen? Is it going to be bad? I'm going to be honest, Cole. Sometimes when I've taken spiritual retreats, and I'll just cry. I'll cry for the first hour and a half, just because sometimes I find that I'm so sad, and I mask it. I just mask it all day long. Yeah. And that can be a little intimidating. So how do people do this, Cole? Like, how do people intentionally press into these hard places and listen without, what are the benefits? What are the benefits that make this worthwhile for people to do this?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, I just want to affirm that you're right to name that it's costly to listen. Like it's a costly practice. And I think I was pretty naive to this when I first started to think about, silence and reflection. And I was really naive, and I would lead these retreats. I remember this, I was training this group of collegiate ministry people who were going to work. And anyways, I was leading this training, and I made them practice this period of like 20 minutes of silence, and they all came back just shattered, devastated, apart from maybe 3 or 4 of them who have had practiced it before. And I remember thinking like, all right, we're gonna take a half-hour break. But I expected naively that everyone was just going to be able to experience silence and kind of contemplation the same way, that everyone would have the same access to it, when the reality is, for many of us, silence and reflection and things like that are what pulls us back into sadness, into traumatic memories, even into things, into the places that we have hesitated to go. And that hesitation is there for a reason. And I think to be in my position, I've learned to really honor this and have compassion on that resistance that people feel, because it's costly. I can't just ask people to be silent without acknowledging it's a complicated process, and who knows what they're going to encounter, and am I prepared to care for them in the wake of that encounter? So I'm really glad you named that, first of all. I think the benefits, though, are, I would say, a kind of rest that you don't meet just by like going to sleep for 8 hours a night, a kind of inner rest. Maybe not immediately, and certainly not every time, but the more I've practiced reflection and kind of paying attention to my stories, the more at peace I am, and maybe the more at peace I am because I um, not only understand my past, but I'm gaining a greater imagination of like what could be. Um, and I talk about rest a lot. I'm a big rest evangelist. I'm like not evangelical about anything, but if I am, it's probably rest. And I think that good contemplation is a form of rest and silence and stillness. And when we do that, we then have access to dreaming in a different way. And I don't mean just like, the symbol and metaphor of like we rest so that we can dream. I really mean that. I really believe that the more rested we are, the more we're able to dream for a different kind of reality. The more our bodies are able to imagine a different way. And so it's a tension, this like stillness, this restful listening, but it also can lead to what I think is a lot of good innovation, a lot of hope, honestly.
Well, I again really appreciate what you do, because I feel like what you're doing is giving permission to people to again carve out that space, not carve out that space for other people to accept and see you, but also carve out space for yourself to take time out to actually really reflect. This might be a little longer response, but like, um, so my family is an immigrant family, and I've never met my grandma. So, and then I went to China like 11 years ago to meet all of my extended family.
Wow.
And it was insane. I think I wept quite a bit. And they're like, "Oh no, she's crying." I'm like, "No, good tears. Good tears, good tears, because you're my people." And we were even the same height, just want to say. But they all said that actually I'm exactly like my paternal grandmother.
Wow.
We have the same, like, I think what they were trying to mean was like chutzpah or spunkiness. And then that just really was heartwarming. You know what I mean? So I think that generational innate wisdom that you're talking about, that sacred wisdom that is actually from our forebears, is so helpful to actually inform who we are today. Like I wouldn't have known that if I didn't go to China, but not a lot of people have that opportunity to go to like meet all of their extended family um, in another country. So that's really important.
That's beautiful.
So I always like to try to tie a hero trait to our guests. And so I was like, as we were talking, I just landed on the hero trait of intentionality. And this is actually from Laurie's book that is coming out, right, Laurie? Of living and acting with an understanding of who we are and what we can uniquely offer others. And I think that you have to do that intentionally. We don't accidentally just become who we are, or I would even say who God has created us to be. But you have to like intentionally and actively carve out the space for that really huge, deep like discovery of who we are.
Yeah.
Cole, we need to wrap up here, but what are your hopes for yourself in 2022 and then for all of us as well? Because, as we're living in this cultural moment, and what do you hope will happen? What are you longing for? I'm going to maybe use your language.
I'm really longing for a kind of habit of writing, of creating that feels more and more authentic to who I am. So I just want to write a bunch, and I just wrote this book, and everyone told me like once you write a book, you just don't want to write for ages. And I'll tell you, like I have just been like ravenous for reading, for writing, and I find a lot of comfort in that. I'm like, okay, maybe I have a few more books in me yet. And so I really want to kind of make time for that, and to create good art that isn't overly concerned with, how many people are going to consume it, but that is very concerned for it being a good representation of what I believe in this season and things like that. So good art. And what I and I think that comes out of what I want for other people, which is rest. I want for all of us. I want rest so bad, because you know we're hitting this Omicron variant wave. The so many of the people that we love are still at risk. We're in this kind of weird in between, where it feels like so much is wrapped up and so many answers have been found, but like I think deep inside we know that we're living day to day with so much fear and so much uncertainty, and we're always kind of waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I think that's an exhausting state to exist in, and an exhausting state to exist in for a global society. It's just a lot to hold, and I'm really hoping that we don't rush too quickly into, you know, life as normal. I'm saying that in air quotes because I don't believe that's going to be a thing anytime soon, or perhaps, not normal as we've known it. But I'm really hoping we don't rush into that. We don't require ourselves to have the same output that we've had in previous years just because we have a vaccine now, hoping that we're able to really pause and reflect on the ways this thing has formed us, and the fears that are in us, and the hopes that are in us. And I think we'll do that if we allow ourselves the space to rest. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And Cole, I would say that I think some of us tried to do that, like back in last June or so, when we thought things were getting better before the Delta came up, and now here we are again. And it feels like maybe we're not supposed to go back to how things were either. And that's maybe another space that we can all be listening to. And and this is this is where spirituality comes from, I think, and where you let your life speak to you, you let the genuine you in you speak to you, you let God speak to you about what should you be doing, how should you be listening and resting, and all these good things. Cole, I feel like I got a little bit of a personal therapy session from you today. This is
Wow. Group therapy.
Just go away for an hour or two and rest. I'm like, oh, good. Somebody's giving me permission to do that. Because sometimes we don't get permission. Right. And so I'm going to tell my husband that Cole said I could. But it's a good word. The other thing that I hope people heard in all of this is that we all have a story to tell. Right. And you have this lovely book that is this it's filled with a bunch of stories from your family that only you could tell, right? There's this saying, or I think this is truism, like within 2 generations will be forgotten. I don't know if you've heard this. This is so depressing. What will last though, Cole, is what we put out there, art, the books, the things that we leave behind, and the stories that we leave behind. And so maybe as we rest, we'll all find that there's a story that we can tell as well. And pick up the pen, write, pick up the computer keyboard, start typing, pick up the video, start sharing. So we all have a story inside of us. Cole, this was so great. I wish we had another hour to talk, but thank you for being on the podcast with us. I hope that our readers, our listeners were I'm saying readers too, because I'm a writer too, but I hope our listeners you guys were all encouraged by this, and that you will go out and just rest during this new year and take some time to discover new things about yourself and about this world. And we'll see you guys next time.